I was 60 years old when I finally realized how far I had drifted from the woman I used to be. My name is Helen, and for most of my life, I believed I was doing just fine. I had a loving husband, two grown children, and four beautiful grandchildren who filled our home with laughter and warmth. Every weekend from the outside, my life looked complete. Everyone thought I was happy and healthy, but deep inside, I knew something was not right. I could feel it in the way my body moved, in the way my energy had faded away. It started with small things: a little stiffness in my knees, a shortness of breath when climbing the stairs, a kind of heaviness that stayed with me all day. I used to laugh it off, thinking it was just age. After all, 60 is not young, but I did not realize how much I was slowly surrendering my strength. Every morning, I would wake up tired before the day even began. I told myself I deserved to rest. After years of taking care of everyone else, I had earned a slow and easy life. That was my excuse to sit more, move less, and eat what made me feel good in the moment. My husband Mark tried to encourage me. He said, "Helen, you need to go out. Take a little walk. It will make you feel better." I smiled and said, "Maybe tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. My body started to change faster than I expected. I gained weight, my clothes no longer fit. My knees hurt so much that I began avoiding stairs. My fingers swelled, and even brushing my hair became a slow effort. My doctor warned me. She said, "Helen, your blood pressure is too high. Your sugar levels are not stable. You need to take care of yourself." I nodded, pretending I would. But as soon as I returned home, I went back to my couch with my favorite snacks and watched television for hours. It was easier to ignore the truth than to face it. I told myself this was normal at my age, but deep down I felt helpless. I began to lose confidence in myself. My family loved me, but I could see the concern in their eyes. My daughter, Emily, would say, "Mom, please eat less sugar. Try this green smoothie, I made it for you." My son James bought me a fitness tracker and said, "Come on, Mom, let's count your steps together." But I laughed and said, "That's for young people, not for me." I had convinced myself that it was too late to change, that this was simply how old age worked. One Sunday afternoon, the family came over for lunch. The house was full of life. The smell of roasted chicken and apple pie filled the kitchen. The kids ran around the living room shouting and playing. I sat on the couch with a smile, trying to look happy, but I felt tired inside. My youngest grandson, Ryan, ran to me holding his baseball glove. He said, "Grandma, you have to come to my game next week. Please promise you will come." I looked into his little eyes full of hope and said, "Of course, sweetheart, I promise." But when he ran away to play, I felt tears in my eyes, because I knew I could barely walk from the parking lot to the field without feeling breathless. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Ryan's words kept echoing in my head. "Grandma, promise you will come." I realized that if I did not change, I might not even have the strength to stand by the field and cheer for him. I thought about how I used to be years ago. I was full of life, always busy, always moving, always taking care of everyone. I cooked, I cleaned, I helped in the garden, I laughed all the time. Now I could barely get up without groaning. I whispered to myself, "What happened to you, Helen? Where did you go?" I turned to look at Mark, who was asleep beside me, and softly said, "I don't want to live like this anymore." The next morning, something inside me shifted. I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was rising and the light touched my face. It felt warm, gentle, and alive. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few moments and thought, maybe I can start small. I put on my old sneakers, the ones covered in dust from the closet. I wore a loose sweatshirt and stepped outside. The air was cool. The birds were singing. The world felt fresh in a way I had forgotten. I started walking down the street slowly, one step at a time. My knees hurt, my breath was short, but I kept moving. A neighbor waved at me and I smiled back. For the first time in months, I reached the corner of the street and stopped. My legs were shaking, but my heart was proud. I had done something. I had moved. I whispered to myself, "You did it, Helen." And I meant it when I returned home. Mark looked at me with surprise. He asked, "Where did you go?" I smiled and said, "For a walk." He laughed gently and kissed my forehead. That simple moment filled me with joy. Later that day, I sat with a notebook and wrote a small list. Drink more water, eat more vegetables, walk every day, sleep early, smile more. I knew I could not change overnight, but I wanted to start somewhere. That night, I looked in the mirror. My reflection was still tired, but I noticed a small difference. There was something in my eyes, something that had been missing for years. Maybe hope. I smiled and whispered, "We start again tomorrow." When I went to bed, I felt a kind of peace I had not felt in a long time. Not because I had done something big, but because I had taken one real step for myself. The next morning, my legs ached, but I smiled at the pain because it meant I was alive. I felt a quiet fire inside me, a belief that maybe, just maybe, I could still change. I could still heal. I did not know what would happen next, but for the first time in years, I was not afraid. I was ready to try again. And that small decision, that single morning walk, became the first page of my new life. The next morning, I woke up with my legs still sore from the walk I took the day before. It felt like someone had tied small weights to my knees, and every movement reminded me how weak I had become. But instead of feeling discouraged, I smiled. It was the kind of pain that told me something was happening, something real. I got out of bed slowly, stretched my arms toward the ceiling, and said to myself, "You can do this, Helen. You are not done yet." I went into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of warm water instead of the usual cup of sweet tea I had been drinking for years. Mark looked at me from behind his newspaper and raised an eyebrow. "Warm water?" he said, surprised. I nodded and said, "I read somewhere it helps the body wake up better than caffeine." He laughed and said, "Well, look at you, already a health expert." We both laughed, but deep inside, I was proud of myself because for the first time, I had made a tiny choice for my health. After breakfast, I put on my sneakers again and went outside for another walk. The air was fresh, the street quiet except for a few neighbors walking their dogs. I walked a little farther this time, to the second corner before turning back. Every step was slow, every breath heavy, but my heart felt light. I was doing something that once felt impossible. When I got home, I felt tired but also full of a strange new energy. Not physical exactly, but emotional, like I was coming back to life. I sat down and looked around the house. The plants on the windowsill had wilted, the kitchen counter was cluttered, and I thought maybe my house had started to reflect how I had been living. Messy, tired, uncared for. I decided to water the plants, clean the counter, and open all the windows. The sunlight came in, and I felt it warm my face. It reminded me of days long ago, when I used to sing while cleaning and feel happy for no reason. I missed that version of myself. I wanted her back. That afternoon, my daughter Emily called. She asked how I was doing, and I told her I had started walking again. She sounded genuinely happy and said, "Mom, that's wonderful! I am so proud of you. Keep going." I told her I would, and for the first time, I actually meant it. She offered to come over with some healthy recipes she wanted to show me, how to make smoothies with spinach and apples. I agreed, and we planned to meet the next day. I spent the evening reading a few articles online about simple exercises for women over 60. I learned about stretching, balance movements, and how small daily habits could make big changes. I felt inspired, as if a whole new world had opened up to me. The next morning, Emily came with a big smile and 2 bags of groceries. She filled my kitchen with colors: green vegetables, yellow bananas, red apples, and even some nuts. She said, "Mom, this is your new medicine, food." She blended a smoothie for me. It was green and looked strange, but when I tasted it, it was surprisingly good. She told me that my body was not the enemy. It was only asking for care. We spent the morning laughing, talking, and planning meals together. It felt so nice to have her close to me, like old times when we cooked side by side. After she left, I felt motivated. I sat down again with my notebook and added more goals. Walk 15 minutes each day, drink 8 glasses of water, avoid sugary snacks, cook one healthy meal every day before sleeping. I checked the boxes for what I had already done. It made me feel accomplished, even if it was just small steps. The following week, I visited my doctor for a routine checkup. She looked at my chart and said, "Your blood pressure is still a bit high, but it's stable." I told her I had started walking, and she smiled. She said, "That's the best medicine, Helen. Keep doing it." I left her office with a new sense of purpose. I wanted to keep my promise to myself. On my way home, I stopped by a local park. I watched a group of older women exercising together. They were laughing and moving freely. I stood there watching them with admiration. One of them noticed me and waved. "Come join us," she said. I hesitated for a second, then thought, why not? I walked over. They welcomed me warmly. One woman, named Carol, said, "We meet here every morning just for light exercise, nothing serious." I joined them and tried to follow their moves. It was harder than it looked. My body felt stiff, but their laughter made everything easier. By the end, I was sweating and out of breath, but I felt alive again. That evening, when I got home, Mark noticed the difference in my face. He said, "You look happy, Helen. What did you do today?" I told him I met some new friends at the park. He smiled and said, "I can see that you are glowing." We had dinner together, grilled chicken and salad instead of fried food. He looked surprised, but ate without complaining. After dinner, I took a walk outside just to feel the night breeze. I looked at the stars and thought how strange it was that at 60, I felt like I was starting a whole new chapter in my life. I was learning to care for myself, not out of guilt or fear, but out of love. I went to bed that night feeling thankful for everything, even for the pain in my legs, because it reminded me that I was moving forward, slowly but surely. Over the next few days, I continued my routine morning walks, park exercises, and healthy meals. Sometimes I felt tired and wanted to skip, but then I would think of Ryan, my grandson, and how I promised to be at his game. That thought gave me strength. One morning, as I looked in the mirror, I noticed that my face seemed a little different. Maybe it was just the light, but I thought I saw a small glow. Maybe it was happiness. Maybe it was hope. Whatever it was, I liked it. I smiled at my reflection and whispered, "We are getting there, Helen. Just keep going." When I lay in bed that night, my heart felt calm, my body sore, but my mind at peace. For the first time in many years, I felt proud of myself. I was no longer just existing. I was living again. A few weeks passed since I started walking every morning, and changing my habits each day felt like a small victory. Sometimes I woke up full of energy, ready to move. Sometimes I wanted to stay in bed and pretend that I was fine. The old habits tried to pull me back, but something inside me kept whispering, "No, Helen, not this time. Keep going." I had joined the small group of women at the park, and we started to become friends. There was Carol, the cheerful one, who always brought a bottle of homemade lemonade, and there was Nancy, who had knee pain like me and still never missed a session. We laughed together, stumbled together, and supported one another. It felt so good to be around women who understood what I was going through. One morning, as we stretched under the shade of a big oak tree, Carol said, "You know, Helen, you have really changed since the first day you came here. You smile more now." I smiled shyly and said, "Maybe it is because of all of you. You make it easier to show up." She laughed and said, "No, dear, it is because you finally showed up for yourself." Those words stayed with me all day. They echoed in my mind and warmed my heart. Later that week, I decided to visit a physiotherapist. My doctor had recommended it months ago, but I had been too lazy, or maybe too scared to go. This time, I booked the appointment. The therapist was a kind woman named Lisa. She greeted me with a gentle smile and asked me to sit. She listened carefully as I explained my pain and told her how I had started walking again. She nodded and said, "That is wonderful, Helen, but we will need to strengthen your muscles too." She taught me a few simple exercises I could do at home, movements for my knees and back. Gentle, but effective, she said. If you do these every day, you will notice a difference. I promised her I would. At home, I rolled out a yoga mat that Emily had given me years ago and started following the exercises. Slowly, it was not easy at first. My knees creaked, my legs trembled, and sometimes I lost balance. But I kept doing them every morning. The more I practiced, the more control I began to feel over my body. One evening, Mark walked in and saw me stretching on the mat. He looked surprised and said, "Wow, Helen, are you training for a marathon?" I laughed so hard that I nearly lost my balance. He smiled proudly and said, "I like seeing you like this, happy and strong." His words made my heart flutter because it had been a long time since he had looked at me that way. Maybe I had been hiding behind my illness, not just from him, but from myself. One afternoon, Emily came over again, and she noticed how light my steps had become. She hugged me and said, "Mom, I am so proud of you." I told her I had started seeing a physiotherapist. She said, "That is amazing. You are finally taking control." We cooked together again, this time using olive oil, fresh herbs, and vegetables. We sat at the table and talked like friends. She told me about her work, her children, and her plans for the summer, and I listened with genuine excitement. It felt like I was reconnecting, not just with my body, but with my family too. My energy started to return little by little. My mornings became active. I would walk, then stretch, then prepare a healthy breakfast of oatmeal and fruit instead of fried eggs and sausages. I began sleeping better too. My sugar levels dropped slightly, and I could feel the difference in my mood. I was calmer, more focused, and even more patient with people around me. One day, Carol suggested we join a weekend wellness workshop at the community center. It was about mindfulness and healthy aging. I hesitated, but she insisted. "It will be fun, Helen, you will love it." So I went. The hall was full of women around my age. Some looked strong and confident. Others looked tired and shy, like I used to feel. We listened to a speaker who talked about how aging was not about giving up, but about transforming. She said, "Your body is your home. Take care of it, feed it, move it, love it." Those words touched something deep inside me. I realized how much I had neglected myself over the years, always caring for everyone else, but never for Helen. After the session, we all sat together and shared stories. Some women talked about losing their husbands, others about fighting illness, some about loneliness, and others about rediscovering their passions. I spoke too. I told them about Ryan, my grandson, and how his one simple sentence had changed everything. How I had been lazy and hopeless, but how now I was slowly learning to live again. Some of them smiled. Others had tears in their eyes. One woman said, "Thank you for sharing that. You make me believe it is not too late." That evening when I got home, I felt lighter. My heart was full of gratitude. I looked around the house and noticed that it no longer felt dull. I had started adding small touches, fresh flowers on the table, soft music playing in the background, candles in the living room. Everything felt alive. Even Mark seemed happier. He laughed more often, and we started taking evening walks together. Sometimes we would just hold hands and talk about old memories. One night he said, "Helen, I feel like I got my wife back." I looked at him and smiled, because I felt like I got myself back too. Days turned into weeks and my progress continued. My body still had pain sometimes, but I stopped letting it control me. Whenever I felt tired, I would rest and then start again. I had learned that consistency was more important than perfection. One morning while walking in the park, Nancy said, "Helen, do you realize you walk faster now?" I laughed and said, Maybe my legs finally remembered what they were made for. She said, "Your spirit remembered too." That evening, I sat by the window, watching the sunset, painting the sky in orange and pink. I thought about how far I had come. It had been months since I started, and for the first time in years, I felt proud of myself. Not because I was perfect, but because I was trying. I whispered quietly, "Thank you, God, for giving me another chance." And as I sat there, feeling the cool breeze on my face, I realized that my journey had only just begun. I was no longer living in fear of age or illness. I was living in the hope of strength and renewal. The morning sun peeked through the curtains and warmed my face as I opened my eyes. I felt that calm and peaceful energy that had become my new favorite feeling. I stretched my arms and legs and realized something incredible. The stiffness that used to greet me every morning was not as strong anymore. My knees still ached sometimes, but the pain had softened into something I could live with. I smiled and whispered to myself, "Progress." I got out of bed and went to the kitchen where the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. Mark was already sitting at the table reading his newspaper. He looked up and said, "Good morning, athlete." I laughed and said, "Not quite, but I am getting there." He handed me my mug and said, "You already are, Helen. You should see how different you look these days." I rolled my eyes playfully, but deep down, I felt a warm pride in my chest. I had been working hard, and it was showing. My face looked brighter, my movements lighter, and most importantly, my heart felt stronger. I was learning to appreciate the little things again. After breakfast, I decided to visit the park earlier than usual. The air was crisp and the birds were singing. I met Carol and Nancy near the bench where we always gathered. Carol greeted me with her usual cheerful smile. She said, "We were just talking about you, Helen. We are thinking about starting a little morning club. We can call it Move with Joy." I laughed and said, "That sounds lovely." She said we could invite more women from the neighborhood because many are struggling like we were, and maybe they just need a small push. I nodded. Immediately, "Yes, let's do it." The next few days were busy. We made small flyers with bright colors and simple words. Join us every morning at 8 for a walk, laughter, and friendship. We handed them out to women at the market, library, and church. By the end of the week, we had 10 new ladies join us. Our small group turned into a cheerful community of women supporting one another. We walked, talked, and laughed. The park that once felt quiet now echoed with our voices. One woman named Susan said, "I have not walked this much in 10 years. Thank you for starting this group." Her smile reminded me of how I had felt on my first day. Every time I saw someone new take their first few steps, I felt proud knowing that I was helping others the same way I had been helped. It felt like giving back to life. One morning after our walk, we sat on the grass drinking water and sharing fruit. I asked everyone what their biggest challenge was. Susan said, "Motivation. Sometimes I wake up and my mind says, 'Stay in bed.' But I think of you all, and I get up." Nancy said, "My knees still hurt, but I am learning to listen to my body, not to give up." Carol said, "My husband says I laugh too loud now. I think that is progress." We all laughed together, and I realized that healing was not just physical, it was emotional too. Every time we shared our stories, we healed a little more. That afternoon, I decided to visit a dietitian Emily had been telling me about. She said, "Mom, you have come so far, but you should also focus on what you eat." The dietitian's office was bright and welcoming. Her name was Dr. Patel. She smiled warmly and said, "Helen, tell me about your routine." I explained everything. My morning walks, my group, my meals. She listened carefully and said, "You are doing wonderfully, but we can make it even better." She taught me about balance, about eating smaller portions more often, about replacing processed food with natural ones. She said food can heal you if you choose it wisely. She gave me a plan filled with colorful meals: oatmeal, smoothies, grilled fish salads, soups, and even healthy snacks. I thanked her and promised to follow it. That evening, I went grocery shopping with my new list. I filled my cart with vegetables, fruits, nuts, and whole grains. It felt strange not buying chips or sugary drinks, but also satisfying. I came home, cooked a simple dinner, and sat with Mark. He looked at the colorful plate and said, "This looks healthy and delicious." I smiled and said, "It is both." We ate slowly, enjoying the flavors and the peace it brought. Over the next few weeks, I followed the new diet and noticed changes. My sugar levels started to stabilize, my digestion improved, and my energy stayed high throughout the day. I did not crave junk food as much anymore. Sometimes I still wanted something sweet, but I learned to enjoy fruit instead of desserts. One evening, Emily came over and saw me preparing a salad. She said, "Mom, look at you. You have become an expert." I laughed and said, "Not yet, but I am learning." She hugged me and said, "I am so proud of you." I could see tears in her eyes. That moment filled me with deep emotion because I knew she had worried about me for so long. Now she could see that I was taking charge of my life again. I began writing small notes of gratitude each night before bed. I wrote things like, "Thank you for my body. Thank you for my family. Thank you for this chance to change." It helped me stay positive and focused. One Sunday morning, I decided to attend a yoga class at the community center. Carol came with me. We were both nervous because neither of us had tried yoga before. The instructor was kind and calm. She guided us through gentle poses, breathing deeply and moving slowly. I struggled at first, but as I focused on my breath, I felt peace wash over me. After class, I felt taller, calmer, and more connected to my body than ever before. I thanked the instructor and promised to return. By now, my days had become beautifully structured. I would wake up early, walk, stretch, eat healthy meals, rest when needed, and spend evenings talking to Mark or reading before bed. My sleep improved, my mood was lighter, and even small things like the smell of rain or the sound of music made me happy again. One night, while watching the sunset from the porch, Mark said, "Helen, you seem different lately, calmer, peaceful." I smiled and said, "I think I am finding myself again." He nodded and said, "I can see that. I am happy for you." As I looked at the fading light in the sky, I thought about the woman I used to be, tired, hopeless, and lost, and the woman I was becoming, strong, alive, and grateful. I realized that healing was not a moment, it was a journey, and I was finally walking that path with open eyes and an open heart. That night before sleeping, I whispered a quiet thank you to life for giving me another chance. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not surviving, I was truly living. The next morning felt different, as if the world had slowed down just enough for me to notice the softness in everything around me. I woke up to the golden light spilling through the curtains and the gentle chirping of birds outside my window. I sat on the edge of my bed for a moment and let the warmth of gratitude fill me. It had been months since I began my journey, and though I had stumbled more than once, I was proud of every small victory. I stretched my arms and smiled before heading to the kitchen. Mark was already there, reading the news. He looked up and said, "Morning, sunshine." I laughed and said, "That nickname is never getting old." He smiled and said, "It suits you more now than ever, because you glow these days." I poured myself some tea and sat down beside him. As I took the first sip, I felt a calm sense of joy. My mornings used to be filled with complaints about pain or fatigue, but now they began with light conversation, laughter, and the comforting smell of tea. After breakfast, I changed into my walking clothes and tied my sneakers. The mirror near the door reflected a woman I was finally beginning to recognize. Not the tired face I once saw, but someone who had learned to care for herself in every way possible. When I reached the park, the group was already gathering. Their smiles always gave me strength. Carol waved from a distance and called out, "We are thinking of adding a weekend yoga session. What do you think?" I said, "That sounds perfect." Susan added, "My daughter says I look happier these days." I told her it is all because of this group. We laughed and began our walk. The crisp air felt refreshing against my skin, and I breathed deeply, feeling every step connect me to the earth beneath me. As we walked, we talked about everything: our families, our memories, our little dreams. Nancy shared how she had started painting again, something she had not done since college. She said, "It makes me feel alive, like I am talking to myself through colors." I smiled at her words because I knew that feeling of rediscovery all too well. Halfway through the walk, Carol looked at me and said, "Helen, do you realize what you started? Look at us. We have become a family." I felt a lump in my throat because I knew she was right. What began as my personal healing had grown into something much bigger. It was no longer just about my pain or my recovery. It was about all of us, finding our strength together. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with my notebook in hand. I began to write about my journey, not as a diary, but as a story. I wanted to capture what it felt like to be lost, and then to find a way back to myself. The words flowed easily. I wrote about the fear, the exhaustion, the laughter, and the hope. As I wrote, I realized how far I had come. Sometimes we live through change so slowly that we forget how incredible it really is. Later that evening, Emily came to visit. She had brought her little daughter Lily, who ran into my arms the moment she saw me. Lily said, "Nana, come play with me." I laughed and said, "Of course, sweetheart." We played in the garden, throwing a small ball back and forth, while Emily watched with a soft smile. After a while, she said, "Mom, I read your notes. They are beautiful." I blinked in surprise. "How did you find them?" She said, "You left the notebook open on the table, and I could not resist reading a few pages. You have no idea how much your story can help others. You should publish it." I laughed nervously and said, "Oh, honey, I am no writer." She said, "You do not need to be. Your words are honest and real. That is what people need." I thought about it for a while. That night, when I went to bed, her words echoed in my mind. Maybe sharing my story could help someone who feels the way I once did. The next day, I took my notes to the local library, where I often spent quiet afternoons reading. I asked the librarian if there was a writing group. She smiled and said, "Yes, they meet every Thursday. You should join them." I hesitated, but agreed. On Thursday evening, I found myself sitting in a small circle of people sharing stories. Some were young and full of dreams, others older, with years of wisdom. When it was my turn to read, I felt my hands tremble. But as I spoke the words, the fear began to melt away. When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then one woman said, "That was beautiful, Helen. It felt like you were speaking for all of us." My heart swelled with emotion. That moment became another turning point for me. From that day on, I began attending the group regularly. I learned to edit, polish, and shape my story, not to make it perfect, but to make it honest. Over time, my story grew into a small book, a memoir of healing, hope, and self-rediscovery. I titled it The Second Sunrise, because that is what it felt like to live again after losing myself. One morning, as I was preparing breakfast, the phone rang. It was the librarian. She said, "Helen, your book has been chosen for the community reading event. We want you to share it with everyone." My hands shook as I held the phone. I said, "Thank you," softly. After the call, I stood there for a while, staring at the sunlight filtering through the kitchen window. I felt a mixture of fear and pride. On the day of the event, the library was filled with familiar faces. My friends from the walking group, Emily and Mark, all sat in the front row. When I began reading, my voice trembled slightly, but soon it found its rhythm. As I looked around the room, I saw women nodding their heads, some with tears in their eyes, others smiling with encouragement. When I finished, the audience applauded, and Carol shouted, "That is our Helen!" The sound of laughter filled the room. I felt tears roll down my cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of gratitude. After the event, many women came to me to share their stories. One said, "I have been struggling with my health for years. Your words gave me hope." Another said, I forgot how to take care of myself. Thank you for reminding me why it matters. That night, when I returned home, I sat quietly on the porch. The air was cool and the stars were shining above. Mark joined me and said, "You did something special today, Helen. You touched hearts." I leaned on his shoulder and said, "I never thought my pain would turn into something that could heal others." He said, "That is the beauty of life. Sometimes our hardest moments become someone else's light." I looked up at the sky and felt at peace. In that moment, I knew that my journey was still unfolding, but I was no longer afraid of what lay ahead because I had learned to trust the rhythm of change. I closed my eyes and whispered to myself softly, "This is my second sunrise, and I will keep walking toward the light." The next chapter of my life began quietly, without any big announcement or grand plan. It was just another morning. The sky painted in soft pinks and golds, the sound of coffee dripping filling the kitchen, the smell of toast, warm and comforting. Mark had gone out early for a round of golf, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I sat at the table and looked at the small vase of daisies my granddaughter had picked for me last weekend. They were beginning to wilt, but somehow they looked more beautiful that way, imperfect and real, just like life. I took a deep breath and smiled, remembering how far I had come in the last year. My days were no longer filled with fatigue or constant pain. I still had my aches, of course, but they did not control me anymore. I controlled them. I had learned that healing was not about eliminating pain, but learning how to live fully despite it. I finished my coffee, put on my walking shoes, and headed to the park. The morning breeze was cool against my face, and the world felt awake, alive, as if whispering encouragement with every rustle of the leaves. I met Carol at the entrance. She waved cheerfully and said, "You ready for our morning lap?" I nodded, and we began walking side by side, our pace steady, our breaths synchronized. It felt good to move my body, to feel my heart working strong and steady. Carol told me about her son moving back to town and how excited she was to have her grandchildren nearby. I listened, smiling at her joy. I knew how precious that kind of connection was. After our walk, I went to the local wellness center for my appointment with Dr. Myers, my physiotherapist. He had been my biggest cheerleader since the beginning. He greeted me with a smile, saying, "Helen, you look stronger every time I see you." I laughed and said, "That is because you keep making me work harder." He chuckled and said, "That is the goal. Now show me that stretch we have been practicing." I followed his instructions carefully, holding each movement steady, focusing on my balance and breathing. When I finished, he nodded approvingly and said, "Perfect. You are moving like someone half your age." I blushed and said, "Oh, stop it." But inside, I felt proud. Driving home, I thought about how different I was from the woman who first came to him a year ago, scared, uncertain, ashamed of her own body. Now I carried myself with confidence, not because I was perfect, but because I had learned to care about my body again. Later that afternoon, Emily called and said, "Mom, we are having a little family dinner tonight. Can you come?" I smiled and said, "Of course, I will be there." I baked a small apple pie and dressed in a simple blue blouse, one that Mark always said made my eyes shine. When I arrived, the house was full of laughter and warmth, the kids running around, the smell of food filling every corner. Emily hugged me and said, "You look radiant, Mom." I said, "It is the pie." She laughed and said, "No, it is you." During dinner, we talked and laughed, sharing stories from old times. My grandson Tyler, who was 12, asked, "Nana, when you were young, did you like running?" I said, "Oh, I loved it. I could run for miles." He looked at me with bright eyes and said, "Do you think you can still run now?" Everyone laughed, but his question stayed with me long after dinner ended. That night, when I came home, I stood by the window looking at the moonlight falling across the yard. Could I still run? I had not tried in years. The thought both scared and excited me. The next morning, I went to the park early, before anyone else arrived. The ground was damp from the night rain, and the air smelled of earth. I began walking slowly at first, then picked up the pace. I could hear my heartbeat quicken, my breath deepen, and then, without thinking, I started to run. It was not fast, it was not graceful, but it was real. I ran for maybe 30 seconds before stopping, my chest heaving, my legs trembling, but my heart felt free. I started laughing out loud, alone in that park, tears mixing with laughter. It was a feeling I could not describe, the sense of being alive, completely alive. I texted Emily later and wrote, "Tell Tyler his Nana ran today." She replied with a string of heart emojis and said, "I knew you could." I sat on the bench, catching my breath, watching the sunrise. I realized this was more than exercise. This was a declaration that I was not done living. Later that week, my story was published in a small local magazine under the title Living Again. I did not expect much from it, but to my surprise, I started receiving letters from women across the town, some even from nearby cities. They shared their stories of struggle with health, loneliness, and the fear of growing old. One letter said, "Your words made me get out of bed this morning and go for a walk." Another wrote, "I cried reading your story because it felt like mine." I read each letter carefully, often with tears in my eyes. It amazed me how deeply we were all connected by our pain and our hope. Soon, I was invited to speak at a local community center to share my journey. I hesitated at first, but Mark said, "You have inspired so many people, Helen. Do it for them and for yourself." The night of the event, I stood before a small crowd of mostly women, my heart beating fast. I began by saying, "I am not an expert. I am just a woman who got tired of feeling tired." And everyone laughed softly. That broke the tension. I told them about the moment my grandson's question sparked my change, about the first walk, the first healthy meal, the first time I said yes to myself again. I spoke honestly about the setbacks too, about days when I wanted to give up, when my body ached and my mind whispered old doubts. But I also told them about the morning I ran again. When I finished speaking, the room erupted with applause. One woman came up and hugged me, whispering, "Thank you. You made me believe I can start over." I held her hand and said, "We all can." The following weeks became busy in the best way possible. I started volunteering at the Wellness Center, helping organize workshops for women over 50. We called it Reclaiming Strength. We met every Saturday morning for light exercise and shared healthy recipes. But mostly we talked, we laughed, and we healed together. One morning after a session, a woman named Sarah said, "Helen, you gave me back my courage." I looked at her and smiled. "You gave it back to yourself. I just reminded you it was there." She hugged me, and I felt tears prick my eyes again. That evening, back home, Mark made tea and said, "You are becoming quite the local celebrity." I laughed and said, "I do not want fame. I just want to remind people that life at 60 or 70 or 80 is still life. It is still beautiful." He raised his cup and said, "To new beginnings." We clinked our cups together, the room filled with quiet contentment. As night fell, I sat near the window, watching the lights flicker across the neighborhood. I thought about all the women who had written to me, and all those who might still be struggling somewhere. I whispered softly to the stars, "If my story can help even one more person find hope, then everything was worth it." I closed my eyes, breathing in the peaceful silence around me, feeling both small and infinite at the same time. This was not the end of my story. It was another beginning, another sunrise waiting quietly beyond the horizon. The seasons began to change again, and I could feel the cool edge of autumn in the air, leaves turning shades of amber and crimson, as if the world itself was celebrating transformation. I loved walking through the park at this time of year. The soft crunch of leaves under my shoes, the faint scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys. Everything felt alive and peaceful. That morning, I met Carol and Susan near the old oak tree. They were both wrapped in scarves, laughing about something Carol said. "Helen, you will not believe it. I signed up for that online dance class you mentioned. I almost fell on my face, but it was fun. I laughed so hard I had tears in my eyes," Susan said. "My husband says he has never seen me this happy." I told him it is because of you ladies. We make each other stronger. I smiled, feeling proud of them, and of myself, too. Our little circle of women had grown since the wellness workshops began. Every week, new faces appeared, women who were tired, scared, or simply curious about how to start over. We welcomed each one with open arms. I had started preparing small talks for the group, nothing formal, just reflections from my journey. I called them gentle reminders. Things like, start where you are, forgive yourself for yesterday, and you are allowed to begin again. One morning after the session, a woman named Janet stayed behind. She looked nervous, her hands twisting the strap of her bag. She said, Helen, I just wanted to say thank you. I was diagnosed with diabetes last year, and I have been so afraid. But hearing you talk made me believe I can handle it. I smiled and said, Janet, you can handle it, one step at a time. You already began by showing up. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and hugged me tightly as I walked home that day. I felt a warmth in my heart, a feeling of purpose. I had spent so many years lost in my own pain, and now that same pain was helping others find light. At home, Mark was in the backyard fixing the fence. He looked up and smiled, saying, You are glowing again. What did you do this time? I said, Just help someone believe in themselves. And he said, Then you did something big. I laughed and said, Maybe I did. A few days later, Emily invited me to speak at her workplace wellness event. I was hesitant, but she said, Mom, your story could inspire so many people. Please say yes. So I agreed. On the day of the event, I wore a simple cream blouse and a pearl necklace. My hands trembled slightly as I waited for my turn to speak. When they called my name, I took a deep breath and walked to the stage. I began by saying, A few years ago, I could barely walk without pain. Today, I walk miles. Not because the pain vanished, but because I stopped letting it define me. I told them about the turning point when my grandson asked me if I could still run, about how that question woke something inside me. I shared how small steps like changing my diet, walking every day, and being kind to myself slowly changes everything. As I spoke, I could see people nodding, some wiping their eyes. Afterward, several people came up to me to thank me. One young man said, My mom is struggling with her health too. I am going to show her your story. That night, Emily called and said, Mom, everyone loved you. They said you gave them hope. I sat on my porch later watching the sky turn deep blue, thinking about the ripple effect of one small act of courage. How one decision to take care of myself had touched so many lives. The next week, I was invited to record a short video for a local health campaign. They wanted real people sharing real stories. I sat in front of the camera, nervous but honest. I said, Sometimes we wait too long to choose ourselves. We think we are too old, too tired, too late. But that is not true. You can start again, no matter your age. Healing is not a miracle. It is a decision. When the video was posted online, I did not expect much, but it spread quickly. People shared it across social media, and the messages began pouring in. Women from other states, even a few from Canada, wrote to me telling me how they saw themselves in my journey. I felt overwhelmed, but deeply grateful. One evening, while I was responding to messages, my grandson Tyler came to sit beside me. He looked at the screen and said, Nana, are all these people writing to you? I said, Yes, honey. And he said, Why? I smiled and said, Because they saw my story and it gave them hope. He paused, then said, I am proud of you, Nana. I hugged him tightly. That simple sentence meant more to me than anything in the world. As the months passed, I began giving small talks at schools and community centers. My favorite moments were when young people came to me afterward, saying they would tell their parents or grandparents to start taking care of themselves. It felt like the message was spreading in ways I had never imagined. One evening, after a talk, a woman in her 70s named Marie approached me. She said, I used to be a nurse, but after my husband died, I stopped caring for myself. I thought, what was the point? Then I saw your video, and today I walked 2 miles for the first time in years. I held her hands and said, that is the point, to live again, to feel again. She smiled through tears and said, thank you. I went home that night and told Mark about her. He smiled softly and said, Helen, you are creating waves of change without even realizing it. I looked at him and said, maybe, but it is not just me. It is all of us, women lifting each other up, finding strength in stories. He said, that is the kind of legacy worth leaving. I thought about that word, legacy. It sounded big, too big for someone like me. But maybe legacy was not about fame or recognition. Maybe it was about the quiet ways we leave hope behind in others. One morning near Thanksgiving, I received a letter from the local council inviting me to speak at their annual community awards event. They said they wanted to honor people who had made a difference through service. I was stunned when I told Mark. He smiled proudly and said, you deserve it. The day of the event, the hall was filled with familiar faces, family friends, women from the wellness group, and even Dr. Myers. When they called my name and handed me the plaque, I felt tears well up. It said, for inspiring hope and health in our community. I held it in my hands and whispered, thank you, silently, not just to them, but to life itself. After the ceremony, Emily hugged me and said, Mom, I always knew you would do something meaningful. I said, I never planned this. It just happened. She said, that is what makes it beautiful. On the way home, I looked out of the car window at the city lights passing by, thinking of the woman I used to be, the one who sat in silence believing her best days were gone. And I whispered to myself, how wrong I was. Later that night, I placed the award on the shelf beside family photos, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what was possible when I said yes to life again. I turned off the lights and sat quietly, the room filled with peace. I closed my eyes and smiled, because I knew this was only the middle of my story, not the end. Winter came softly that year, the kind of winter that wrapped everything in silence, snowflakes drifting lazily from the sky like feathers, and the air, holding that still calm that makes the world feel brand new. I loved watching the snow fall from my kitchen window, the world outside covered in white, while the smell of cinnamon tea filled the room. Mark had gone to the garage to fix something, as he always did when the weather turned cold. I smiled, thinking how some things never change. I sat at the table writing notes for the next wellness session we were planning. It had been almost 2 years since I started this journey, and sometimes it amazed me how much had changed, not just in my body, but in my heart. I had grown softer and stronger at the same time, more forgiving toward myself, more patient with life. The phone rang, breaking my thoughts. It was Emily, her voice warm and full of energy. She said, Mom, guess what? My company wants to start a wellness program and they want me to help design it. I said, that is wonderful, honey. She laughed and said, I am stealing all your ideas. I told her, steal as much as you like. I will take it as flattery. She said, I learned everything from you anyway. After we hung up, I sat there smiling. The thought that my choices were now inspiring my daughter filled me with joy. I remembered how she used to worry about me constantly, always telling me to eat better, to rest more. And now, here she was leading others toward balance. It felt like the circle of care had turned, and I was finally seeing the beauty of what we passed down without even realizing it. Later that afternoon, I bundled up in my coat and went for a walk. The air was crisp, and my breath made small clouds in front of me. The park was quiet, only a few people walking their dogs or jogging. I found peace in that solitude, each step crunching softly in the snow, reminding me that I was still here, still moving, still capable. I stopped near the frozen pond and watched the light shimmer across the surface. It reminded me of how fragile and yet strong life could be. I closed my eyes for a moment and whispered a quiet thank you to the universe for bringing me here, for letting me see beauty again. On my way home, I met Carol. She was wearing a red hat that made her look years younger. She said, "Helen, we are thinking of organizing a holiday gathering for the group. What do you think?" I said, "I think it is a perfect idea. We could make it a celebration of health and friendship." She clapped her hands and said, "Leave the planning to me. You just bring that apple pie everyone loves." I laughed and promised I would. The following week, we decorated the community hall with fairy lights and candles. The room looked magical, warm, and glowing. People brought homemade dishes. Laughter filled every corner. We shared stories, sang songs, and even danced a little. When it was my turn to speak, I looked around the room and said, "When we started meeting here, most of us were searching for strength. But look at us now. We became each other's strength." The applause that followed felt like a wave of love washing over me. After the celebration, I walked home with Mark, hand in hand. The snow was falling again, and our footprints left a trail behind us. He said, "You know, Helen, I never thought I would see you dance again." I smiled and said, "Neither did I. But it feels good, doesn't it?" He said, "It feels amazing." The new year came quietly, with fireworks lighting up the sky. We stood on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching them burst into color. I made a silent promise to myself that I would keep growing, keep learning, keep giving. In January, a local magazine asked if they could do a feature on me and the wellness group. They sent a young journalist named Rachel to interview me. She was bright, curious, and full of life. As we talked, she said, "What do you think changed you the most, Helen?" I thought for a moment, then said, "Learning that I was not broken, that I could heal if I just listened to what my body and heart were trying to tell me." She nodded, writing quickly, then asked, "And what would you say to other women your age who feel hopeless?" I said, "I would tell them, hope is not gone. It is just quiet, waiting for you to notice it again." She smiled and said, "That is beautiful." When the article came out, the response was overwhelming. More women started joining our sessions, and soon we had to book a bigger hall. I watched as friendships bloomed, laughter echoed, and the energy of life filled the room. One morning, after a class, a woman approached me and said, "Helen, I have been on medication for years, but for the first time, I feel like I can breathe again. Thank you for reminding me I am still alive." I hugged her tightly and said, "You did the work. I just showed you the door." That night, I sat by the fireplace with Mark, sipping tea and watching the flames flicker. He said, "Do you ever think about how far you have come?" I said, "Sometimes it feels unreal." He said, "It feels earned." We fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that only comes after years of shared life. The fire crackled softly, and I thought about how healing was not just about the body. It was about rediscovering joy in simple things: laughter, warmth, connection, love. The next morning, I received an email from a health organization. They were hosting a regional wellness conference and wanted me to be a guest speaker. My hands trembled as I read it. I never imagined speaking to such a large audience, but something inside me said yes. I replied with gratitude and accepted. In the weeks that followed, I prepared my speech carefully. I wanted it to be honest, not polished. I wanted people to hear the truth of what it means to fall apart and rebuild yourself. On the day of the conference, the hall was full, hundreds of people from different backgrounds, all listening as I stood at the podium. I took a deep breath and began. I said, 2 years ago, I thought my life was ending. I thought pain had stolen everything from me. But pain became my teacher. It taught me to slow down, to listen, to heal. I looked at the audience and continued. Health is not just numbers or tests. It is how you treat yourself when no one is watching. It is how you speak to yourself in the mirror. It is believing that you are worth the effort. When I finished, the room was silent. Then applause filled the hall. Some people stood clapping, their faces shining with tears. Afterward, many came to thank me. Some asked for advice, others just wanted to hug me. One woman said, "I am 70, and I thought my story was over, but now I see it is just beginning." I smiled and said, "That is exactly how I felt the first day I decided to change." When I returned home that night, I stood in front of the mirror looking at my reflection. My hair streaked with silver, my eyes filled with light. I whispered to myself, "You did it, Helen. You found your way back." I turned off the lights and stood there in the quiet glow of the moon, knowing this journey was not ending. It was simply unfolding into something even more beautiful, something still waiting beyond tomorrow. Spring returned with its soft rain and scent of blooming flowers, and I could feel the promise of renewal in the air. Each morning felt lighter, the sun rising earlier, as if encouraging me to keep moving forward. I had always loved spring. It reminded me of second chances, of how even after the coldest winter, life found a way to begin again. One morning, I woke up early and decided to take a longer walk than usual. The grass sparkled with dew, the air fresh and cool. I passed the pond where ducks floated lazily and children fed them bits of bread. Everything looked alive and full of joy. As I walked, I thought about how different my life felt now. My days no longer revolved around pills or appointments or exhaustion. Instead, they revolved around small, beautiful moments like this. I stopped for a moment, took a deep breath, and whispered, "Thank you for letting me live long enough to feel this peace." When I got home, Mark was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He smiled and said, "You look happy." I said, "I am happy." Said, "You have become my morning inspiration." I laughed and said, "Me? Inspiring you? That is new." He said, "No, you always did. But now you remind me that change is possible at any age." We sat there in silence, sipping our coffee, watching the world wake up. Later that week, I received an email from a woman named Laura. She was from another state and had read my story online. She wrote, "I am 62 and struggling with arthritis and diabetes. I saw your video and I want to change, but I do not know where to start. Please tell me how you began." I wrote back, sharing my simple steps: walking for 10 minutes every day, choosing fresh food over processed meals, drinking more water, and most importantly, being kind to herself. She replied 2 weeks later saying, "I did it. I walked every day and my sugar levels have started improving. Thank you for giving me hope." Reading her message filled my eyes with tears. It felt surreal to know that my pain had turned into someone else's strength. I shared the message with our group during our next session, and everyone cheered. Carol said, "See, Helen? You are changing lives, one story at a time." I smiled, but deep inside, I knew it was not just me. It was all of us, showing what resilience could look like. That evening, Emily called and said, "Mom, I was thinking we should record your sessions. Maybe start a small YouTube channel to help more women?" I laughed and said, "Me? On YouTube?" She said, "Why not? You are natural when you speak, and your message could reach so many." I thought about it and then said, "Okay, let us try." We started small. Emily brought her camera and recorded our sessions. Nothing fancy, just honest moments of women sharing their experiences, laughing, moving, talking about health and healing. When the first video went online, I was nervous. But within a few days, messages began flooding in. Women from across the country wrote to say they felt seen, they felt understood. One comment said, "I showed this to my mom and she cried because she said it felt like listening to herself." Another said, "I did not know where to begin, but now I feel I can start somewhere." Reading those words made my heart swell. I realized this was more than a personal journey. Now it was a movement, a ripple spreading wider than I could have dreamed. One Saturday after our class, Carol surprised me with a large card filled with handwritten notes from all the women in the group, each one thanking me in their own way. One wrote, "Thank you for teaching me how to love my body again." Another said, "I no longer wake up afraid of my reflection." I held that card close to my chest, feeling waves of gratitude. That night, I sat with Mark on the porch again, the sun setting in hues of gold and pink. He said, "You know, you are making history, right?" I laughed and said, "Oh, please. I am just sharing my story." He said, "No, Helen. You are showing people what it means to live, truly live." I looked at him and said, "Maybe that is all any of us can do. Live with purpose." The next morning, I received a call from a local radio host. She said, "We would love to have you on our show to talk about your journey and your group." I hesitated, but agreed. The day of the interview, I sat in the studio, my heart pounding slightly. The host smiled and said, "Helen, your story has touched so many. What message would you like to give to our listeners?" I took a deep breath and said, "I want everyone listening to know it is never too late to begin again. Your body is wiser than you think, and your heart stronger than you believe. Take one small step today and keep going. That is all it takes." After the show, I received dozens of calls and messages from listeners. One man wrote to say, "My wife and I listened together, and we have decided to start walking every evening. Thank you for inspiring us." Those small moments of connection felt like gifts, tiny reminders that kindness and courage were contagious. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a local high school to talk about health and self-care. It felt strange to stand before teenagers, but I realized that these lessons were for everyone. I told them about my story and how self-neglect slowly takes over when we stop valuing ourselves. I said, "Take care of your body now, because it carries you through everything you dream of doing." One girl came up to me afterward and said, "My grandma is sick and sad. I am going to show her your video." I hugged her and said, "That means more to me than you know." When I returned home that day, I found Mark in the garden planting tulip bulbs. He looked up and said, "I am getting ready for next spring." I smiled and said, "Always planning ahead, huh?" He said, "That is the secret to life. Never stop planting new beginning." That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened, how one decision years ago had grown into something I never imagined. I thought of the women who walked with me, the ones who had learned to smile again, to move again, to believe again, and I felt this deep sense of peace. I whispered into the darkness, "Thank you for giving me another chance at life." A few days later, Emily came over with Lily. They brought flowers and laughter and sunshine into the house. Lily sat beside me and said, "Nana, when I grow up, I want to be like you." I asked why, and she said, "Because you make people happy." My eyes filled with tears. I hugged her tightly and said, "Then you already are, sweetheart, because you just made me the happiest person in the world." After they left, I sat quietly in the living room, watching the evening light fade, and I realized something profound. Happiness was not about reaching a destination. It was about choosing joy every single day. It was about gratitude for the simple things, the people we love, the moments we share, and the courage to begin again. I leaned back and smiled because, after all these years, I finally understood what it meant to live fully. Not perfectly, but honestly, with an open heart and a hopeful spirit. Autumn came softly, painting the trees with gold and crimson, and the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of leaves and rain. I loved sitting by the window, watching the colors change. It felt like the world was turning another page, just as I had in my own life. I often found myself reflecting on the past, not with regret anymore, but with gratitude for how far I had come. My mornings started early now. I would make my tea, stretch for 10 minutes, and step outside for my walk. Sometimes Mark joined me. Sometimes I went alone, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I used to think aging meant slowing down, but now I saw it as an invitation to live more mindfully, to notice everything, the sound of birds, the way the sunlight touched the ground, the laughter of children heading to school. I started writing a journal during that season. I wrote about small victories like walking an extra mile or sleeping through the night without pain. One entry read, "I feel strong today. My knees didn't ache, my hands moved easily, and I felt young for a moment again." Another entry said, "I laughed with my daughter today, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel forced." Writing became a form of therapy, a way to remind myself that progress was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and deeply personal. One afternoon, as I was journaling, the phone rang. It was Laura, the woman who had written to me months ago. She said, "Helen, I wanted to tell you that I joined a community class just like yours. I've lost weight, my sugar levels are normal, and I feel alive again." I smiled through tears. She said, "It's all because you gave me hope." I told her, "You did that yourself. You just needed someone to remind you that you could." She laughed and said, "Maybe, but I'll always be grateful." That night, I told Mark about the call, and he said, "I hope you realize how many lives you're touching." I said, "Sometimes I still can't believe it." He said, "Believe it. You earned every bit of this peace." I looked at him and said, "You were there through all of it, even when I was at my worst." He smiled and said, "That's what love means, sticking around through the hard parts." I reached for his hand and said, "Then we must be experts in love." He laughed softly and kissed my forehead. Later that week, I visited my doctor for a regular checkup. She looked at my results and said, "Helen, these numbers are remarkable. Your sugar is stable, your blood pressure is perfect, your joints are improving." I told her I've been working on myself. She said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. You're proof that lifestyle changes really work." I left her office feeling lighter than air. When I got home, I looked at my reflection in the mirror, not at my wrinkles or my gray hair, but at the glow in my eyes, the quiet strength in my face. It wasn't about looking younger, it was about feeling whole. One evening, Emily and Lily came over for dinner. I made a simple meal: roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, and salad. When we sat down to eat, Lily said, "Nana, this food looks like a rainbow." I laughed and said, "That's because healthy food is colorful." Emily said, "Mom, I've been following your meals online. People are loving your recipes. Maybe you should write a cookbook." I said, "A cookbook? At my age?" She said, "Why not? Your story and your food inspire people. Together, it would be perfect." I thought about it for a moment and said, "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for another new beginning." We spent the rest of the evening laughing, sharing memories, and talking about plans. The house felt warm, filled with joy. Later, after they left, I stood in the kitchen cleaning up and thought about how far life had come, from the days when I barely had the energy to stand, to this moment where I felt strong enough to start something new. The next morning, I began writing ideas for my cookbook. Not just recipes, but little notes about life lessons I had learned along the way, like how patience is the secret ingredient to healing, or how gratitude adds flavor to every meal. I called it Nourish the Soul and Body by Helen. I shared a few pages with Emily, and she said, "Mom, this is beautiful. It's not just a cookbook, it's your story." I smiled and said, "Then it's perfect." The following week, Carol invited me to her birthday lunch. All the women from our group were there. They greeted me with hugs and laughter. Someone brought a cake shaped like a dumbbell as a joke. We all laughed so hard my sides hurt. Carol stood up and said, "I want to thank Helen for changing my life. She showed me that aging doesn't mean fading. It means blooming differently." I felt tears in my eyes. I said, "Thank you. But you all changed me too." We lifted our glasses of sparkling water and toasted to health, happiness, and new beginnings. After the party, I walked outside. The sky was cloudy, but soft light filtered through, and I felt that familiar sense of peace that had followed me lately. It was like the world whispered, "Everything is exactly as it should be." That evening, I sat on the porch watching the wind move through the trees. Mark joined me and said, Do you ever think about what would have happened if you never changed? I thought for a moment and said, I would probably still be sitting on this porch, but with pain in my body and regret in my heart. He said, I'm proud of you, Helen. I smiled and said, I'm proud of us both because you walked this road with me, he said, always. I leaned my head on his shoulder and we sat quietly, listening to the crickets singing in the night. The world felt still, yet alive, a perfect reflection of how I felt inside. Later, as I got ready for bed, I looked out the window. The moon was full, shining brightly over the neighborhood. I whispered a little prayer of thanks for everything, for the pain that taught me strength, for the love that carried me through, for the hope that never let me give up. As I closed my eyes, I realized something profound. Healing never really ends. It just becomes a part of who you are, a gentle rhythm that keeps your heart beating in harmony with life. And in that moment, surrounded by quiet and love, I drifted into sleep with a smile, knowing that tomorrow would bring more reasons to be grateful. Winter arrived quietly, and the first snowfall covered the town in a blanket of white. I stood by the window watching the snowflakes fall, slow and gentle, like a promise of peace. Everything looked calm, the world hushed and still. Mark came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my shoulders, and said, You have always loved the snow. I smiled and said, Yes. It reminds me that even the coldest days can be beautiful. He said, That is true. You have become softer and stronger all at once. I laughed softly and said, Maybe that is what healing looks like. Not loud or dramatic, just quiet, steady, and kind. That winter was special. It felt like a season of reflection and gratitude. Our little wellness group decided to hold a holiday gathering. We called it the Celebration of Change. Everyone brought healthy homemade dishes, and we decorated the community center with candles, pine cones, and strings of fairy lights. The room glowed with warmth, laughter, and stories filled the air. Carol made her famous lentil soup. Linda brought a tray of fruit and nuts, and I prepared baked salmon with herbs. We ate together like a family we had become over time. After dinner, we took turns sharing what we were grateful for this year. When it was my turn, I said, I am grateful for courage, the courage to start when it felt impossible, the courage to fail and try again, and the courage to love myself enough to keep going. Everyone clapped. Some even wiped away tears. Then Carol stood up and said, Helen taught us that we are never too old to become our best selves. This group has changed my life. We hugged, and someone started music, soft and cheerful. Soon we were dancing, not perfectly, not gracefully, but joyfully moving to the rhythm of being alive. I laughed so hard that my cheeks hurt for a moment. I looked around and thought, this is what healing looks like. Not pills or numbers, but moments like these, full of love and laughter. When I came home that night, I sat in my favorite chair by the fireplace, the flames flickering gently, and thought about the woman I used to be, the one who woke up tired and hopeless every day, the one who avoided mirrors, who felt lost in her own skin. I barely recognized her now. I whispered, Thank you to that version of me, because she held on long enough for me to find my way. The next morning, Emily called. She said, Mom, your cookbook is ready to publish. The editor loved it, and they want to feature you in a health magazine. I gasped. I could not believe it. She said, I told you this would happen. Your story is powerful. I said, I never dreamed my life could inspire anyone. She said, Well, it has, and it will keep doing that. I hung up the phone and sat there smiling, feeling both proud and humble. When the magazine came out, it had my picture on the cover holding a bowl of salad. The headline read, Helen Turner, the woman who proved it is never too late to change. I laughed out loud when I saw it. Mark said, I always knew you were cover material. I said, Oh, please. And he said, No, really, you deserve every bit of this recognition. The article told my story from the days of struggle to the journey of rediscovering health. It included pictures from our group and quotes from other women who said that my journey gave them strength. Reading it made me cry, not out of sadness, but from the realization that my pain had turned into something good. That weekend, we hosted a small gathering at our home to celebrate. Friends, neighbors, and family came. Even my doctor showed up. She smiled and said, "I should hire you to motivate my patients." Everyone cheered, and Lily ran up to me holding a copy of the magazine, saying, "Nana, you are famous now." I laughed and hugged her tightly, saying, "I am just happy if my story helps people." Later that evening, after everyone left, the house was quiet. Mark poured 2 cups of tea and said, "I hope you know how proud I am." I said, "I think I do, but hearing it still means everything." He said, "Promise me one thing, never stop inspiring people." I smiled and said, "I promise." As winter deepened, the days grew shorter and colder, but my heart felt warmer than ever. I spent time writing, responding to letters from women around the country, sharing advice or encouragement. Many wrote to say they had joined walking groups or changed their diets. Some sent photos of themselves smiling with their grandkids or cooking healthy meals. Every letter reminded me of the power of sharing stories. One day, while checking my mail, I found a handwritten note from a woman named Marjorie. She wrote, "I am 70, and I had given up on myself, but your story reminded me that hope is medicine. I have started walking again. Thank you." I pressed that note to my heart and whispered, "Thank you for letting me be part of your healing." As the new year approached, I began planning a new community project called Steps of Strength, a program where women over 50 could walk together 3 times a week and share their stories. We started small, 10 women on the first day, walking slowly through the park, talking and laughing. As the weeks went by, the group grew bigger. By February, we had 30 women, all walking together, bundled in coats and scarves, but full of life. One woman said, "I haven't felt this alive in years." Another said, "My doctor said my sugar is finally under control." I smiled, listening to them, realizing that the movement was no longer just mine. It belonged to everyone. It was a circle of hope that kept expanding. One morning, after our walk, we stood watching the sunrise. It was cold, but the light was golden, touching everything gently. I said to the group, "This sunrise is just like us. No matter how cold the night, there is always light waiting to return." They all nodded quietly. One of them said, "Helen, you have given us more than advice. You have given us our lives back." I felt my eyes fill with tears and said, "No, you gave yourselves back. I only reminded you of your strength." That evening, when I got home, I found Mark sitting by the fire, reading. He looked up and said, "You look radiant." I said, "Maybe because I am filled with gratitude." He said, "You should be. You have built something beautiful." I sat beside him holding his hand, feeling the warmth of the fire, the calm of the room, and the quiet joy that filled my heart. Outside, snow began to fall again, and I thought about how each snowflake was different, yet together they created something breathtaking, just like all of us. Each woman with her own story, her own struggles, her own strength. And together we had built something that sparkled with hope. As I went to bed that night, I whispered to myself, "I am not done yet. Life still has chapters to write, and I am ready for every one of them." Spring came again, as if the world had decided to start fresh once more. The air was soft and full of new scents. The days grew longer, the sunlight warmer, and I could feel that same spark of renewal deep inside me. It had been almost 3 years since that moment when Lily's innocent words had shaken me awake. 3 years since I had chosen to take back my life, and every day since had been a gift. I woke up early that morning, opened the window, and let the fresh air fill the room. Mark was still sleeping, his gentle snoring blending with the sound of birds outside. I smiled and whispered, "Thank you for another day." I made my tea, sat on the porch, and looked at the blooming garden. Tulips, roses, and daffodils danced in the breeze. A living reminder that growth always follows struggle. Later that day, I had a meeting with our community center to discuss expanding our wellness program. The Steps of Strength project had grown faster than I ever expected. Women from other towns wanted to join. Some even traveled hours to walk with us. The director said, "Helen, we've received requests to open new chapters in 3 other cities. Would you be willing to train local leaders?" I sat there in awe, thinking how something that started as a small walk in the park had become a movement. I said, "Yes, of course. I would love that." She smiled and said, "You are making history." I laughed and said, "No, we are just learning to live fully." She said, "Sometimes that is exactly what history needs." After the meeting, I called Emily to tell her. She screamed with excitement, saying, "Mom, this is huge! Do you realize you are helping women everywhere?" I said, "It feels unbelievable, but also right." She said, "It is your calling. You found it." I smiled and said, "Maybe life always had this plan for me. It just waited until I was ready to listen." That evening, I hosted our weekly group session. But this time, something felt different. We had new members, women who had driven from other towns to meet us. The room was buzzing with energy. I stood in front of them, nervous but grateful, and said, "Welcome, everyone. When I started this journey, I never imagined it would bring us all together. You are the proof that it is never too late to choose yourself." The women clapped and smiled. One woman raised her hand and said, "Helen, how do you stay so positive all the time?" I said, "I am not always positive. I have bad days too. But I remind myself of 3 things. First, gratitude changes everything. Second, movement is medicine. And third, kindness heals more than we know." She nodded and wrote it down as if it were gospel. After the session, one of the new women approached me. She said, "I lost my husband last year, and I thought my life was over. But seeing you and all these women laughing gives me hope again." I hugged her tightly and said, "You are home now. This is your tribe." When I got home that night, Mark had lit candles on the porch. He said to celebrate the expansion. I made dinner for us. I laughed and said, "You never stop surprising me." He said, "That is the secret to a long marriage." We ate outside under the stars, the air cool and gentle, the food simple but full of love. After dinner, we sat quietly listening to the crickets. He said, "Do you ever think about what comes next?" I said, "Sometimes, but I do not need to plan every step anymore. I just follow where joy leads." He smiled and said, "That is the best plan of all." A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a national health conference in Chicago. They wanted me to share my story and talk about the power of lifestyle change. At first, I hesitated. The idea of standing in front of hundreds of people terrified me. But Emily said, "Mom, you have already spoken to hearts. This is just a bigger room." So I agreed. The day of the conference, I stood backstage holding my notes, my hands trembling a little. When they announced my name, I took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the room filled with faces of all ages. I began by saying, 3 years ago, I was a woman who had given up. I was tired, sick, and afraid. But one moment changed everything. One small question from my granddaughter made me ask myself, do I want to live or just exist? That question saved my life. I told them about the walks, the struggles, the laughter, the women who joined me, and how every act of self-love rippled outward, changing more lives than I could count. By the time I finished speaking, the room was silent. Then the audience stood and applauded. Tears filled my eyes. I had never felt so humbled. Afterward, people lined up to talk to me, share their stories, hug me. One woman said, "You reminded me that I can still dance." Another said, "I am going home to start my own group." I left that conference with my heart so full, it felt like it could burst. When I returned home, Mark was waiting at the airport holding flowers. He said, "So, how does it feel to be a national inspiration?" I laughed and said, It feels like being exactly where I was meant to be. He said, I always knew you were special. I said, we both are. We made it here together. That night, we celebrated quietly at home, the fire crackling, the house peaceful. Emily called to say she was proud of me, and Lily shouted in the background, saying, Nana, you are famous! I laughed and said, no, sweetheart, I am just happy. One evening, a few months later, I received a letter from the National Health Foundation. They wanted to honor me with an award for community inspiration. I sat in silence reading the letter, tears streaming down my face. I whispered to myself, this is not my award. It belongs to every woman who chose to stand up. Again, at the ceremony when I accepted the award, I said, I am just one voice among many. I only lit a small candle, and the women around me turned it into a bonfire. When I finished speaking, I looked out at the audience and saw Emily and Mark standing together, clapping proudly. Afterward, I went home, placed the award on my shelf, and sat by the window looking at the stars. I said quietly, thank you for this life, for every hardship that led me here, for every breath that still fills my lungs. In the following weeks, I slowed down a bit, spent more time gardening, reading, and simply being. I found peace in ordinary days. I would wake up, make breakfast, watch the sunrise, and feel content. One morning, Lily came over. She had grown taller. She looked at me and said, Nana, can I come on your walks? I said, of course, sweetheart. She held my hand as we walked through the park, her laughter ringing through the air, and I realized this was the greatest gift of all. Not the awards or recognition, but the chance to show her what strength and hope look like in real life. As we reached the pond, she said, Nana, you are my hero. I bent down, hugged her, and said, and you are mine. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned pink and gold, I sat on the porch with Mark. He said, you know, Helen, you have created something that will outlive you. I smiled and said, maybe, but what matters most is that I lived it fully, every step of the way. He took my hand and we sat in silence, the breeze soft, the world peaceful, my heart full. I looked up at the stars and whispered, life is not about how long it lasts, but how deeply we live it. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by love and gratitude, I knew I had truly lived. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so more people can find a little warmth and hope in these stories too.